After that night, everything changed in the village. Word spread quickly about what had happened to Aunt Enkay at the cemetery. Some people said she had been attacked by evil spirits. Others whispered that it was Benjamin's mother's ghost protecting her son. But everyone agreed on one thing: the cemetery was not a place to mess with anymore. Benjamin's life fell into a strange new pattern. Every morning, he would wake up in his little tent, and there would always be food waiting for him on the flat rock, sometimes bread and tea, other times rice or yam. He would eat, thank his mother, and then walk to school with his borrowed books. At school, things were different too. The other children didn't make fun of him anymore. Instead, they watched him with a mixture of fear and awe. Even the teachers treated him differently, speaking to him softly and carefully, as if he might disappear at any moment. One morning, as Benjamin sat eating his breakfast by his mother's grave, he heard footsteps approaching. His heart jumped, thinking Aunt Enkay had come back. But when he looked up, he saw Miss Grace, his teacher, walking slowly toward him. "Benjamin," she called out softly, "may I sit with you?" He nodded, moving over to make space for her on the ground. Miss Grace sat down, her eyes taking in the small tent he had built and the plate of food beside him. "Benjamin," she said gently, "I've been watching you. Every day you come to school clean and well-fed, even though you live here. How is that possible?" Benjamin looked at his mother's grave and smiled. "My mama takes care of me," he said simply. Miss Grace's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" "Every morning, I find food here," he explained, pointing to the flat rock. "And at night too. I never go hungry anymore. Sometimes I find new clothes, and once, I even found soap and a toothbrush." Miss Grace listened, her face showing both concern and amazement. "But Benjamin, who brings these things?" "My mama does," he said firmly. "I know you don't believe me, but it's true. She protects me too. You heard what happened to Aunt Enkay when she tried to take me away." Miss Grace shivered slightly at the mention of that incident. The whole village had heard about it, and no one could explain what had really happened. "Benjamin," she said carefully, "I want to help you. You can't live in the cemetery forever. What about your future?" Benjamin looked at her, his eyes serious. "But I'm not alone here. My mama is with me. She wants me to go to school and learn. That's why she gives me everything I need." As if to prove his point, a sudden breeze swept through the cemetery, rustling the leaves of the trees. Miss Grace felt a strange sensation, like a gentle touch on her shoulder. She jumped up, her heart racing. "Did you feel that?" she whispered. Benjamin nodded calmly. "That's my mama. She wants you to know I'm safe here." Miss Grace stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say or do. Everything she knew told her that a child living in a cemetery was wrong and dangerous. But there was something about Benjamin's calm certainty, about the strange occurrences in the graveyard, that made her wonder if there was more to this than she could understand. "Will you at least let me bring you some blankets?" she asked finally. "The nights are getting colder." Benjamin smiled. "Thank you, Miss Grace, but don't worry. Look." He crawled into his tent and pulled out a thick blanket. "I found this here yesterday morning. Mama knows when I need something." Miss Grace nodded slowly, still trying to process everything she had seen and heard. As she turned to leave, she looked back at Benjamin one last time. He was sitting by the grave again, talking softly to his mother as if she were right there beside him. Walking away from the cemetery, Miss Grace couldn't shake the feeling that she had just witnessed something beyond her understanding. The love of a mother, it seemed, was stronger than death itself. The rainy season came to the village, bringing with it dark clouds and heavy downpours. Benjamin's little tent, despite being well built, struggled against the strong winds and rain. One particularly stormy night, As thunder crashed overhead, Benjamin huddled in his tent, water dripping through the leaves. "Mama," he whispered, his voice trembling, "I'm scared. The rain is too heavy." Just then, a flash of lightning illuminated the cemetery, and Benjamin saw something strange through the gaps in his tent. There was a figure standing by his mother's grave, a woman in a flowing wrapper, glowing softly in the darkness. Benjamin's heart stopped. He rubbed his eyes and looked again, but the figure was still there. Even through the rain, he could see her face clearly. It was his mother. "Mama," he called out, his voice barely a whisper. The figure turned to him, and Benjamin saw her smile, that same warm, loving smile he remembered so well. She raised her hand and pointed to something behind his tent. Benjamin crawled out, ignoring the rain that soaked his clothes. Following her gesture, he found a path he had never noticed before. It led to an old groundskeeper's shed hidden behind some trees. The shed was small but sturdy, with walls that could keep out the rain. When he looked back, his mother's figure was gone, but the path to the shed seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. Benjamin quickly gathered his few belongings and ran to the shed. Inside, it was dry and surprisingly clean, as if someone had prepared it for him. In one corner, he found a small mat with fresh sheets and blankets. There were shelves with canned food, bottles of water, and even some new clothes. A small table held his school books and a kerosene lamp. Benjamin stood in the middle of the shed, tears mixing with the raindrops on his face. "Thank you, Mama," he whispered. "Thank you for giving me a real shelter." That night, as the storm raged outside, Benjamin slept peacefully in his new home, wrapped in a warm blanket and surrounded by his mother's love. He dreamed of her again, but this time, she wasn't just a memory. She was real, sitting beside him, stroking his hair as she used to do when he was younger. "My brave boy," she said in his dream, her voice full of pride. "You're growing stronger every day. Keep going to school, keep learning. I will always be here to protect you." Benjamin woke up the next morning feeling different. The storm had passed, and sunlight streamed through the small window of the shed. As he got ready for school, he found a new set of notebooks on the table, along with a proper school uniform that fit him perfectly. When he arrived at school that day, everyone noticed the change in him. He walked taller, smiled more, and even raised his hand to answer questions in class. During break time, some of the other children gathered around him. "Is it true?" one girl asked. "Did you really see your mother's ghost last night?" Benjamin looked at them calmly. "My mama is always with me," he said. "She takes care of me and protects me. That's all you need to know." The children whispered among themselves, but nobody dared to make fun of him. Even the biggest bullies in school kept their distance, having heard about what happened to Enkay. Miss Grace watched Benjamin from her classroom window, noticing his new uniform and the light in his eyes. She had heard the whispers about strange lights in the cemetery during the storm, about a glowing figure seen standing over a grave. Part of her wanted to dismiss it all as stories, but then she remembered what she had felt that day in the cemetery, that gentle touch, that undeniable presence. Later that day, as Benjamin walked back to his new home in the shed, he felt happier than he had in a long time. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was living. He had a shelter, food to eat, clean clothes to wear, and most importantly, he had his mother's love, even if it came in ways that others couldn't understand. By his mother's grave, he found a plate of his favorite jollof rice waiting for him. As he sat down to eat, he felt that familiar warm breeze, his mother's touch, and smiled. "I love you too, Mama," he whispered. "Thank you for never leaving me." The sun set over the cemetery, casting long shadows across the graves. The night was cold and quiet as Benjamin lay in his small shed, his frail body curled up under a thin blanket. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, rustling the leaves in a way that always made the graveyard feel alive. Benjamin shivered and clutched his blanket tighter. He had tried to sleep, but his thoughts wouldn't let him rest. His mind wandered back to the plate of food he'd found earlier. It wasn't the first time he'd found food there, but lately as his classmates at school poured in their questions about how a ghost could prepare his meal, he'd started to question it too. As he closed his eyes, willing himself to drift off, a faint noise broke the silence. It was subtle, almost like the shuffle of footsteps across the dry leaves outside his shed. Benjamin's eyes snapped open, his heart racing. "Who's out there?" He sat up slowly, straining to listen. The sound came again, closer this time. His hands trembled as he reached for the small stick he kept beside him for protection. The footsteps stopped just outside the shed, and for a moment, there was only silence. Benjamin held his breath, his eyes fixed on the door. Then, he heard it, the soft creak of the shed door being pushed open. Benjamin's heart pounded so loudly he was sure whoever was outside could hear it. He tightened his grip on the stick, ready to defend himself. But before he could move, the door creaked shut again. Gathering every ounce of courage he had, Benjamin crept to the door and peeked outside. The moon cast a pale light over the cemetery, and in the distance, he saw it, a silhouette. It was the figure of a woman, her frame slender and her movements deliberate. She walked toward his mother's grave, her head slightly bowed. Benjamin froze, his breath caught in his throat. "Who is she?" The woman bent down by the grave, placing something on the flat rock. As she stood up, she turned briefly, and the moonlight illuminated her face just enough for Benjamin to catch a glimpse. But before he could process what he'd seen, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees. Benjamin's legs felt like lead, but curiosity overpowered his fear. He stepped out of the shed, his bare feet cold against the damp earth, and slowly made his way to his mother's grave. On the flat rock lay a steaming plate of fried plantains and beans. He stared at the food, his heart pounding. "Mama," he whispered, his voice trembling, "are you really watching over me?" He wanted to run after the woman, to demand answers, but his body wouldn't move. Instead, he sank to his knees beside the grave, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you," he whispered. "Whoever you are, thank you." That night, as Benjamin returned to his shed, his thoughts swirled with questions. Who was the woman? Why was she helping him? And why did she keep her presence a secret? The mystery consumed him, making sleep impossible. Benjamin sat by his mother's grave late into the night, his head resting against the cool stone. The mystery of the woman weighed heavily on his mind, but his heart was filled with a strange peace. As the hours passed, the cool night air lulled him into a deep sleep. In his dream, the graveyard transformed. The dry earth turned lush and green, and the trees swayed gently under a golden light. Benjamin stood, confused, and then he saw her. His mother. She was dressed in her favorite wrapper, her face glowing with warmth and love. She smiled, the kind of smile that could make all the pain in the world disappear. Benjamin's eyes filled with tears. "Mama," he cried, running to her. She knelt and pulled him into her arms, her touch soft and familiar. "My brave boy," she whispered, stroking his hair. "You've been so strong. But it's time to leave now." Benjamin pulled back, confused. "Leave? I can't leave you, Mama. This is the only place where I feel close to you." His mother cupped his face in her hands, her eyes filled with sadness and love. "I will always be with you, Benji. No matter where you go. But you can't stay here forever. You have a bright future ahead of you. Go to school. Learn. Become the man you're meant to be." "But Mama..." She placed a finger on his lips, silencing him. "I'll still watch over you. And there are others who love you too. Let them help you." Before Benjamin could respond, the golden light began to fade, and his mother's form dissolved into the breeze. He reached out, trying to hold on to her, but her voice lingered, soft and reassuring. Go, my son. It's time to leave. Benjamin woke with a start, tears streaming down his face. The graveyard was dark and silent, but his mother's words echoed in his mind. He looked at the grave, his heart heavy but resolute. I'll make you proud, Mama, he whispered. The dream lingered in Benjamin's mind long after he woke up. His mother's words, her glowing face, her soft but firm tone, go, my son. It's time to leave. The message was clear, but his heart wrestled with it. How could he leave? This was the only place where he felt close to her. As dawn broke, he sat by the grave, staring at the flat rock where food would always appear. The plate from the night before was still there, empty, a reminder of the strange kindness that had kept him alive. He whispered into the stillness, Mama, I don't want to leave you. His stomach growled, but his heart was heavier than his hunger. Days passed, and while Benjamin continued to survive on the mysterious provisions, his thoughts grew darker. He spent hours sitting in silence by the grave, feeling trapped between longing and fear of the unknown. Miss Grace noticed the change in him. At school, Benjamin's once sharp mind seemed dulled. He wasn't answering questions or staying behind to learn as he usually did. After class one day, she called him aside. Benjamin, she said gently, what's wrong? You've been quiet lately. He hesitated, staring at the floor. Nothing, Ma, he murmured. Miss Grace frowned. Benjamin, I know you. You're carrying something heavy, and it's affecting you. Please talk to me. Her kind tone broke through the wall Benjamin had built around himself. Slowly, he told her about the dream, about his mother urging him to leave. But I can't, he said, his voice cracking. I feel like I'm abandoning her. Miss Grace listened, her heart breaking for the boy. When he finished, she placed a hand on his shoulder. Your mother wouldn't ask you to do something unless it was for your good, she said softly. But I understand this is hard for you. Benjamin, I want to help you. There's a small room here at the school that's empty. You can stay there if you're ready to leave the graveyard. Benjamin looked at her, his eyes wide. Stay here? Yes, she said with a gentle smile. You'd have a bed, proper meals, and a place to study. Maybe even make new friends. You don't have to decide now, but the offer is open whenever you're ready. Benjamin nodded slowly, but the knot in his chest tightened. That night, as he lay in the groundskeeper's shed, a warm, safe place that had become his refuge, Benjamin thought about Miss Grace's words. The idea of living closer to school among regular humans every day was tempting, but the thought of leaving the graveyard, where he felt his mother's presence so strongly, still felt like a betrayal. The decision hung over Benjamin for weeks. The food continued to appear, but the mystery surrounding it only deepened. He felt torn between the life Miss Grace offered and the connection he felt to his mother at the graveyard. One evening, after days of indecision, Benjamin sat by his mother's grave and spoke aloud, his voice trembling. Mama, he said, I don't want to leave you. But Miss Grace says I can have a better life if I go to the school. What should I do? The wind picked up, brushing against his face like a gentle caress. For a brief moment, he felt a strange warmth in his chest, as if his mother was there with him, encouraging him. That night, as he slept in the shed, he had another dream. His mother's voice came to him once more, soft and reassuring, Go, my son. This is what I want for you. When Benjamin woke, his heart was lighter. He visited Miss Grace that morning and told her, I'm ready to leave the graveyard. Tears filled Miss Grace's eyes as she hugged him tightly. You're making the right choice, Benjamin. Your mother would be so proud of you. Miss Grace helped him move into the small room at the school, a simple space with a bed, a desk, and a window that let in plenty of sunlight. Though it was far from luxurious, To Benjamin, it felt like a new beginning. For the first time in years, he fell asleep without the hard ground beneath him, knowing he was one step closer to fulfilling his mother's dream. While Benjamin adjusted to his new life, Auntie Nkem's world spiraled out of control. After Benjamin left, her business struggled. Without him to hawk oranges, she had to hire others, but they lacked his dedication and brought in little profit. Desperate to keep her business afloat, she took out a loan from a local lender. At first, it seemed like a solution. She used the money to buy more stock, hoping to turn things around. But the sales didn't improve, and the interest on the loan quickly became unmanageable. The lenders were ruthless. They came to her house weekly, demanding repayment. Each visit left her more desperate and humiliated. Her once proud demeanor crumbled under the weight of her debt. Her neighbors began to notice her struggles. "Serves her right," one woman said. "She treated that poor boy like dirt. Now she's paying for it." Auntie Nkem grew bitter, blaming Benjamin for her downfall. "If that useless Benjamin hadn't run away, none of this would have happened," she muttered to herself. But deep down, she knew the truth. Her cruelty had driven him away, and now she was facing the consequences. Meanwhile, Benjamin continued to thrive. With Miss Grace's mentorship, he excelled in his studies. He started a program at school to help other orphan children, raising funds and organizing resources for their education. Weeks turned into months, and Benjamin's life took a surprising turn since he left the graveyard. His new life at the school's housing facility was simple but fulfilling. His days were filled with classes, laughter with friends, and long conversations with Miss Grace, who continued to mentor him closely. He began to excel under her guidance. She had taken a special interest in him, often staying after class to help him with his studies. Benjamin's natural intelligence and determination shone through. One day, during the school assembly, the head teacher made an announcement. "We are proud to inform you that one of our students, Benjamin Okoro, has been awarded a scholarship to attend Bright Horizons Secondary School." The crowd erupted into applause, but Benjamin stood frozen, his heart pounding. "A scholarship? Me? How?" Tears filled his eyes as he glanced at Miss Grace, who smiled proudly from the front row. That evening, Benjamin sat by his mother's grave, clutching the scholarship letter. "Mama," he whispered, his voice trembling, "I did it. I'm going to secondary school. Thank you for watching over me." Over the next few years, Benjamin thrived. At Bright Horizons, he became known as the top student, winning awards and earning the admiration of teachers and classmates. Miss Grace continued to mentor him, visiting him at school and encouraging him to aim even higher. By the time Benjamin turned 15, he had grown into a confident, intelligent young man. His time at Bright Horizons Secondary School had transformed him. Yet, no matter how far he came, a part of his heart still lingered in the cemetery, where he'd spent so many lonely nights by his mother's grave. One Saturday, Benjamin decided to visit the cemetery. He felt guilty for being away for so long and wanted to lay fresh flowers on his mother's grave. With a small bouquet in hand, he made the familiar walk, his thoughts swirling. Memories of the mysterious food and clothes that had sustained him haunted his mind. Who was helping me all those years? And why wouldn't they show themselves? When he reached the graveyard, he stopped short. Someone was there. It was an older woman, kneeling by his mother's grave, her back to him. She held a broom in one hand, carefully sweeping away dried leaves and dust. Benjamin's heart skipped. The sight of her was eerily familiar. "Hello," he called out hesitantly. The woman froze. Slowly, she turned, and Benjamin's breath caught in his throat. It was Mama Esther, her weathered face lined with age but soft with warmth. Her eyes widened when she saw him, and for a moment, she simply stared. Then her face broke into a smile, one full of pride and affection. "Benji," she said softly, setting the broom aside as she stood. Her gaze lingered on him, her eyes filling with tears. "Look at you. You've grown into such a fine young man." Benjamin stepped closer, his heart pounding. "Mama Esther, what are you doing here?" Before she could answer, she reached out and pulled him into a tight hug. He froze for a moment, startled, but then relaxed into her embrace. Her arms felt strong despite her frailty, and he could feel her tears wetting his shoulder. When she finally pulled back, she held his face in her hands, her eyes searching his. "I can't believe it," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "The last time I saw you here, you were just a scared little boy, sleeping by the grave, hungry and broken. And now look at you. You're strong, confident. Your mother would be so proud of you." Her words struck something deep in Benjamin. His brows furrowed as a memory stirred, the nights he spent by the grave, the mysterious food that kept appearing, the sense that he was never truly alone. He stepped back, his curiosity sharpening. "Wait. How do you know what I was like back then? How do you know I slept by the grave?" Mama Esther's face faltered. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. She glanced at the grave and then back at Benjamin, her hands trembling slightly. Finally, she sighed and gestured for him to sit on the edge of the grave. "Benji," she said quietly, sitting beside him, "there's something I need to tell you." Benjamin frowned, his heart racing. "What is it?" She clasped her hands tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the ground. For a long moment, she said nothing, as if gathering the courage to speak. Finally, she looked up, her eyes glistening with tears. "I've been coming here since your mother passed," she began. "I couldn't bear to see you suffer, Benji. You were just a little boy, all alone in the world. Your mother, she was my best friend. We grew up together, shared everything. When she died, I promised her I'd look after you. When you stopped coming to me for food, I became worried and had to look for you. That was when I found you here sleeping at the grave under the scorching sun that day." Benjamin's breath caught in his throat. You were the one leaving the food. The clothes." Mama Esther nodded, her tears falling freely. "It was me. But it wasn't just me, Benji. Miss Grace helped too. Do you remember when you got the scholarship? She and I worked together to make it happen." Benjamin froze, his mind racing back to the day Miss Grace had handed him the scholarship letter. He remembered her saying, "You had some help, Benjamin. Some people really believe in you." At the time, he hadn't questioned it, too overwhelmed by the news. Now, the pieces began to fit. She said something about getting help," Benjamin murmured, his voice filled with realization. "That was you?" Mama Esther nodded, her smile bittersweet. "Miss Grace came to me one day, desperate to find a way to get you out of this place and into school. I told her I'd do everything I could. I wrote letters, reached out to charities, and even used the little savings I had to make sure you had what you needed. We did it together, Benji, because we believed in you." Benjamin stared at her, his mind spinning. The mystery that had haunted him for years unraveled in an instant. He felt a mix of emotions, relief, gratitude, and a pound of sadness. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice breaking. Mama Esther reached for his hand, her grip firm despite the tears in her eyes. "I was afraid. I didn't want to scare you or give your aunt an excuse to hurt you even more. But I see now that I should have told you. You deserve to know the truth." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of the flowers on the grave. Finally, Benjamin said, "Thank you, Mama Esther. You saved me." She smiled, her tears falling freely. "You saved yourself, Benji." I only gave you what you needed. The strength to survive, that was all you. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the cemetery, Benjamin felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The mystery that had defined so much of his life was no longer a burden. He had answers, and he had Mama Esther, his silent guardian, now no longer a stranger in the shadows. "Will you come visit me at the school?" Benjamin asked as they stood to leave. Mama Esther nodded. "Of course, my boy. I'll always be here for you." As Benjamin and Mama Esther walked out of the cemetery that evening, neither could have predicted how much life would change in the years to come. Life has a strange way of coming full circle, and soon, a twist of fate would bring Benjamin face to face with the very person who had once made his life a living nightmare, his Enkay. Difficult decisions would be made. What choices would be made? Only time would tell. Find out in part 4. Did you enjoy this story? What stood out for you in the story? Did you learn something? Please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to give us a like, subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you get notified when the next video is out. Thank you for watching.